What if the greatest empires in history were not built by genius, but by delusion? Not by strength, but by a fatal flaw hardwired into our brains? From the Romans to the conquistadors, a hidden glitch in human psychology has been the true architect of our world and its greatest destroyer. You have these same flaws in your mind right now. Confirmation bias. We think of the Spanish conquistadors as gold-hungry adventurers, ruthless and brave, carving out an empire with steel and gunpowder. But the accepted story misses the true engine of their conquest. Their most dangerous weapon wasn't the sword, cannon, or horse. It was a flaw in their thinking, an unshakable conviction that allowed them to see only what they were destined to find. The disturbing truth is, they weren't just looking for treasure. They were looking for proof that their God had chosen them, and every glint of gold was his divine confirmation. This was the power of a confirmation bias so absolute it could topple empires. When Hernán Cortés and his 500 men landed in Mexico, they entered a world guided by prophecies, a world that their minds immediately began to warp. The Aztec belief in the return of the feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, became, in Cortés's view, a premonition of his own arrival. Every gift from Emperor Moctezuma, every gesture of diplomacy, was not seen as a political calculation from a sophisticated ruler, but as the fearful submission of a heathen confirming the Spaniards' divine mandate. When they finally laid eyes on the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, a floating city of canals and pyramids larger than any in Europe, they did not see a marvel of engineering. They saw pagan temples dripping with gold. The intricate Aztec knowledge of astronomy, their complex social structures, their poetry and art, all of it was rendered invisible, filtered out by a mindset that could only process the world in two categories: obstacles to God's will or proof of his favor. The evidence they sought was everywhere, because their belief system manufactured it from everything they saw. This psychological programming allowed a handful of men to dismantle a civilization of millions with terrifying speed. Even after they were driven from the city during La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, suffering a devastating defeat, their bias didn't break. The loss was not evidence that they were wrong, but merely a test of their faith. Every victory afterward was a miracle. Every act of cruelty, a righteous necessity. They built a world by seeing only what they wanted to see, raising cathedrals on the foundations of temples they refused to understand. A terrifying thought, but how often do we do the same? Searching not for the truth, but for evidence that proves we are already right? Survivorship bias. When we picture Rome, we see the Colosseum, its iconic arches standing against the sky. We see the aqueducts, still carrying water after 2 millennia. We see an empire of relentless genius, a story of unbreakable strength and engineering mastery. This is the myth. It's powerful, awe-inspiring, and it's a complete illusion. The disturbing truth is that our entire perception of Roman greatness is a trick of the mind, crafted by history's most powerful cognitive bias, survivorship bias. We only see what lasted. For every aqueduct that stands, others collapsed into rubble, their blueprints and engineering flaws lost to time. For every victorious legion that marched through Rome in triumph, others marched into oblivion. 50 years before the Teutoburg disaster, the triumvir Crassus led 7 legions into the Parthian desert at Carrhae. He was outmaneuvered, his forces annihilated, and the legionary standards, the sacred eagles of Rome, were captured, a humiliation that haunted the empire for decades. The true story of Rome is written not just in its marble arches, but in its vast, unmarked graveyards in the deserts of Mesopotamia and the forests of Germany. Nowhere is this clearer than in the year 9 AD, in the dark heart of Germany's Teutoburg forest. 3 of Rome's finest legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, a force of nearly 20,000 elite soldiers, were led into a perfectly executed ambush. For 3 days, they were butchered. It was a failure so complete, so humiliating, that the numbers of the lost legions were never used again. The Emperor Augustus, driven to madness, would beat his head against the palace walls, screaming, "Give me back my legions!" This disaster should have been a death blow. Yet today, it is a footnote. This is the secret to Rome's power. Its true genius wasn't in being invincible, but in having the scale and resilience to absorb failures that would have shattered lesser powers. The empire was a crucible that burned away its mistakes, leaving only the hardened steel of its successes for posterity to admire. We see the triumphant survivor, not the thousands of failures it stepped over to achieve its greatness. It makes you wonder, how many of our modern success stories in business, in tech, in our own lives are just the lucky survivors of a hidden graveyard of failures? Sunk cost fallacy. World War I is remembered as a story of brave soldiers led by incompetent generals, a tragic, pointless slaughter orchestrated by men who didn't value human life. But this simple picture of blame ignores the deeper, more insidious psychological trap that ensnared an entire generation of leaders, forcing them to continue down a path of mutual destruction. The disturbing truth is that the generals kept ordering men to their deaths for the same reason a gambler keeps betting on a losing hand. They had already invested too much blood to ever turn back. This was the sunk cost fallacy on a horrifying scale. The war was supposed to be over by Christmas of 1914. Instead, it descended into the grinding horror of trench warfare. At battles like Verdun and the Somme, the casualty counts became monstrous. The British Army suffered over 57,000 casualties on the first day of the Somme alone. At Verdun, nearly 1 million men were killed or wounded. Each loss was an investment. Each fallen soldier, a debt that could only be repaid with victory. To stop, to seek peace, would have forced leaders like General Haig to admit that the hundreds of thousands already dead had died for nothing. That truth was psychologically and politically impossible to accept. The pre-war cult of the offensive doctrine had convinced them that to retreat or stop was a moral failure, compounding the bias. So, they doubled down. More men were sent over the top into a hail of machine gun fire, more shells were fired, and more resources were poured into the meat grinder. The initial investment of lives became the justification for spending millions more. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires all shattered under the relentless pressure, unable to escape the psychological prison they had built for themselves. The war became its own reason for being. But that's the trap, isn't it? The logic feels sound at the moment. How many of us stay in a bad job, a failing project, or a toxic relationship, all because we've already invested too much to walk away? The bandwagon effect. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century seems like a calculated strategic division of a continent among the great European powers. A cynical but logical game of geopolitical chess played by shrewd statesmen. But the reality was far more primal, far more chaotic, and far more absurd. The disturbing truth is that Europe wasn't colonizing Africa for grand strategy or for profit. They were doing it for one simple reason: because everyone else was. It was a continent-wide land grab driven by the deeply human fear of being left behind. For centuries, the vast interior remained the dark continent, but when the explorer Henry Morton Stanley's expeditions, funded by King Leopold II of Belgium, revealed the Congo's potential riches, it set off a chain reaction. Suddenly, owning a piece of Africa became a status symbol. Germany's Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, once declared colonies a weakness, but under a media frenzy and intense political pressure at home, even he was forced to join the race. The logic was circular. A colony was valuable simply because other powerful nations had them. The actual economic worth was an afterthought. This frenzy led to the Berlin Conference of 1884, where 14 European nations gathered to draw lines on a map. They established absurd rules like effective occupation, which only accelerated the rush as nations sent men scrambling to build forts and plant flags to solidify their paper claims. They carved up a continent they did not know, splitting ethnic groups and ancient kingdoms with the stroke of a pen, all to avoid conflict amongst themselves. It was a formal set of rules for a collective mania. A whole continent and its millions of inhabitants were consumed by a peer pressure-fueled panic. It's a terrifying thought that the fates of millions can be decided not by reason, but by the simple primal fear of being left out. How much of what you believe is based on what's popular rather than what's true? Overconfidence bias. Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest military mind in history. A man who seemed invincible, a true man of destiny who redrew the map of Europe with his genius. That's the legend, and it's the very legend that destroyed him. The disturbing truth is that when Napoleon turned his eyes to Russia in 1812, he failed to see that his greatest enemy was not the Tsar, but his own unshakable belief in his invincibility. At Austerlitz and Jena, he performed miracles. He had come to believe his own myth. This overconfidence led him to assemble the Grande Armée, over 600,000 men, the largest European army in history. His belief in his genius was so total that the logistical planning for a prolonged campaign in the vast, harsh Russian interior was fatally inadequate. He expected a quick, decisive battle because that's what he had always achieved. But Russia was not Austria. The Russians simply retreated, burning the earth, stretching his supply lines into a thread. Napoleon's brilliant tactical mind was useless. His enemy was space itself. He captured Moscow only to find it a smoldering, hollow prize. And then, as the first snowflakes began to fall, he finally understood his mistake. His true opponents were not soldiers, but General Winter and General Distance. As the Grande Armée began its long, horrific retreat, his overconfidence gave way to a frozen reality. The legendary Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, was reduced to leading a tiny rear guard, fighting with a musket like a common soldier. Starvation, frostbite, and relentless Cossack raids dissolved the legendary army into a frozen, stumbling column of ghosts. Fewer than 100,000 made it out. His genius was real, but his downfall came from believing his own hype, a fatal overestimation of his own abilities. Where in your life are you mistaking a string of luck for infallible talent? In-group bias. We see ancient China's forbidden city as a symbol of immense power and unshakable tradition. The serene, untouchable center of the world, governed by millennia of wisdom. This image of strength hides the fatal weakness that brought the entire dynasty crashing down. The disturbing truth is that its rulers, cocooned by ritual, saw the encroaching Western powers not as a threat, but as an annoyance, a fatal mistake born from the belief that only those inside the walls truly mattered. This was in-group bias. For millennia, the Chinese worldview positioned China as the sole civilized nation on Earth. All others were barbarians. This created an echo chamber. A perfect early example was the Macartney Embassy of 1793. The British came to negotiate trade as equals. The Qing court could only perceive them as tributaries presenting gifts to the emperor. This fundamental misunderstanding set the stage for a century of conflict. When British warships arrived in the First Opium War, the court saw them as unruly pirates. The catastrophic defeat did little to break the spell. The bias reached its surreal climax with the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. The Empress Dowager Cixi, surrounded by court eunuchs who told her only what she wanted to hear, chose to believe the claims of peasant mystics who said they were impervious to bullets. She declared war on the world's 8 most powerful nations simultaneously. It was an act of collective insanity, the final spasm of an in-group so detached from reality it could no longer tell the difference between belief and fact. They were blinded by their own bubble. But what about ours? The news we watch, the people we follow online? How much of it is just an echo chamber, reinforcing what we already think and leaving us blind to the real world? Anchoring bias. The British Empire in India looks like a straightforward military and political conquest, a story of ships, soldiers, and administrators imposing their will on a subcontinent through superior force. But the initial takeover was much quieter, more gradual, and far more insidious. The disturbing truth is the British did not arrive in India with armies, but with ledgers. Their initial goal was simply trade, an anchor point so modest it masked a slow-motion conquest. This was the anchoring bias. For over a century, the East India Company was just a collection of trading posts. They were merchants. This initial identity as a commercial enterprise became the psychological anchor that justified every decision that followed. As the Mughal Empire weakened, the company's mission began to shift. To protect their warehouses, they hired private soldiers. This was simply security. To ensure favorable deals, they began meddling in the affairs of local princes. This was protecting investments. Each escalation was a small, logical step, tethered to the original anchor of trade. The tipping point came at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive, a company man, led a private army of 3,000 against a local force of 50,000 and won through bribery and deceit. As a result, the company was granted the Diwani, the right to collect taxes from Bengal, a province richer than Britain itself. That single contract, anchored to the idea of a business deal, turned a corporation into a state. A private company now ruled over millions, all under the guise of good business. They bought a continent one reasonable decision at a time, their conquest hidden in plain sight behind a corporate ledger. It makes you ask, what small initial ideas are you anchored to that are now leading you to a place you never intended to go? The availability heuristic. The success of the Mongol Empire seems simple, an unstoppable horde of brilliant cavalry that overwhelmed every civilization they encountered. We picture a wave of destruction, a force of nature. But their greatest weapon was never the composite bow. It was psychology, expertly wielded by one of history's most brilliant generals, Subutai. The disturbing truth is, the Mongols conquered more land in 25 years than the Romans did in 400, not just with the sword, but with the story. They weaponized the availability heuristic. Genghis Khan and Subutai understood they didn't need to be everywhere. They just needed the story of their terror to be everywhere. They turned conquest into psychological theatre. When the Khwarezmian Empire defied them, they made an example that the world would never forget. They unleashed their hordes on the great Silk Road cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. They didn't just conquer them, they erased them. After a city fell, its population was systematically divided and slaughtered. Eyewitness accounts tell of pyramids being built from severed heads. The Khan would often allow a few terrified survivors to escape, turning them into unwilling messengers. This one, easily recalled story of utter annihilation, became the only information that mattered. When the Mongol army later approached another city, its rulers weren't calculating their defensive odds. They were picturing the pyramids of skulls. That vivid, available image paralyzed their will to fight. In contrast, cities that surrendered immediately were often spared, their inhabitants folded into the empire. This created a clear, brutal choice, reinforced by the one terrifying story everyone knew. They conquered the world by conquering their enemies' imaginations. How much of your own fear is driven not by the actual risk, but by the one terrifying story you can't get out of your head? Fundamental attribution error. The British Empire saw itself as a civilizing force, a noble mission to uplift the world, captured in the famous phrase, "the white man's burden." This was the story they told themselves, a story of benevolent progress, a story that hid a profound and self-serving psychological lie. The disturbing truth is, this moral justification was powered by the fundamental attribution error. The bias is simple. When we succeed, we credit our own innate character. When we fail, we blame our situation. But for others, we do the opposite. The British looked at their own immense power, the product of a specific set of circumstances like the Industrial Revolution, and saw it as proof of a superior British character. They were enlightened, ordained to lead. Then they turned their gaze outward. This bias had its most horrific consequences during the Great Famine of 1876 in India. As millions starved to death, a clear situational crisis, the British Viceroy, Lord Lytton, attributed the problem to the indolence of the Indian people, a perceived character flaw. He resisted large-scale relief efforts, believing they would encourage laziness, and the administration continued exporting record amounts of grain from a starving country. He transformed brutal conquest and lethal mismanagement into a benevolent mission. Taking control of another nation's land was no longer theft. It was the responsible thing to do. It was a cognitive bias that rebranded greed as destiny and subjugation as salvation. It's a self-serving story, but we all tell it. When we succeed, it's our talent. When we fail, it's bad luck. When others fail, it's their own fault, isn't it? Hindsight bias. The fall of Constantinople, a turning point in history that feels, in retrospect, completely and totally inevitable. A crumbling ancient empire, a relic of the past, giving way to the vibrant, technologically superior Ottoman power. It feels like the only way the story could have ended. But that feeling is the final illusion. The disturbing truth is that before it happened, the outcome was anything but certain. The city had stood for over 1,000 years. For 53 days, a few thousand defenders, led by the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, held off a massive Ottoman army. The siege was a contest of technology and will. The Ottomans had the monstrous supercannon designed by Urban, but the defenders, led by the brilliant Genoese soldier Justiniani, relentlessly repaired the legendary walls. The city's fate came down to a few unlocked gates and a final desperate push. It was a moment of pure, chaotic chance. But once the city fell, that uncertainty vanished from memory. Hindsight bias began its work. European chroniclers immediately began to reframe the story. Suddenly, the Byzantine Empire was remembered not as a bastion of Christendom that was tragically extinguished, but as a decadent relic that was destined to collapse. The Sultan's victory was no longer a hard-won gamble, but the fulfillment of prophecy. This rewriting of the past had profound consequences. It excused the failure of Western Europe to send aid and normalize the Ottoman Empire's new status as a dominant world power. It turned a moment of trauma into a footnote. So, the next time you feel absolutely certain you're right, the next time you refuse to walk away from a bad investment, or the next time you judge someone's failure without knowing their story, remember the empires, the ghosts of Rome, of Napoleon, of Constantinople. They are all whispering the same warning. The flaw that toppled them isn't in the history books, it's inside of you.